Hi everyone, welcome to our webcast today on the post-COVID U.S. labor market. What can we expect in 2025? We are audio only today. We have such invigorating content. We didn't want to distract anybody with our camera, so we're going to go in this format today. I'm Elizabeth Crowfoot, Senior Economist with the Conference Board, and I'm coming to you live from Washington, D.C. It's my pleasure to be your host for today's conversation. So we're going to be looking into our crystal balls today to discuss the long-term implications of COVID on the U.S. economy and the labor market specifically. So let's dive into some of the topics that we're going to be addressing today. So first we'll start out with a brief short-term economic outlook. The where are we now, in essence. Then we'll shift gears to the long-term outlook. Specifically as how demographic concerns are really going to be driving this long-term outlook, and we'll be discussing that. Then we'll talk about the long-term COVID-related trends that will impact the economy and our labor market. And we'll also be talking about the most disrupted industries and occupations by 2025. And specifically related to automation and how that's going to impact the long-term outlook. And finally, if we have some time at the end, we're going to dive into some business geography implications, specifically about the long-term impact of decreased consumer spending in city centers and labor demand in those areas. So moving on, we are offering CEU credits today for this webcast. I just want to remind everyone, if you are eligible or trying to get these credits to stay online for the entirety of the webcast, do put in your name and email address in the box provided. And for those CPE credits, make sure that you click OK on those pop-ups that are going to appear on your screen throughout the program. And joining me today are my two colleagues from the Labor Markets Institute. First, Gad Lebanon, Vice President of Labor Markets for the Conference Board. Most recently, he has been leading all of our research on the labor market impacts of COVID-19 and is a regular contributor in Forbes. And he just posted a piece on the top 10 pandemic job market trends, which I suggest you all check out. Just Google Gad Lebanon Forbes and you'll find it. So welcome, Gad.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Pleasure being here.
And also joining me is Frank Steemers, economist at the Conference Board. He is one of our primary researchers focusing on U.S. and global labor markets and one of the main authors of an upcoming report on the human capital responses to COVID-19 pandemic. Good to have you on, Frank. Okay, great. So let's go ahead and dive in. And this is going to be a very interactive session. So we're going to start with the poll question to really get everybody warmed up. So if I could get that poll question, great. So what is the top pandemic-related economic trend that you think will impact the U.S. economy and the labor market in the long term? So first we have the rise in remote work and/or the work from anywhere mentality, the consumer shift to online purchasing and delivery. This relates to both goods and services like telehealth and online education, increased business innovation and/or automation, the rise in industry concentration due to store closures and bankruptcies, state and local government budget crisis, and finally the decline of city centers due to that decreased consumer spending in those areas. So we see some of those responses still coming in. We'll give it a couple more seconds here. Give it 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Great. And it looks like most people do think that the rise in remote work is going to primarily be driving this long-term impact on the economy and the labor market. About 19% that shift to online spending, and then somewhat even on the other factors here at around 9, 10, 11% Gad, I'll turn to you for some reactions. Do you have, does this spark any thoughts?
No, I think I would agree. I would choose number one because I think the shift to remote work, or the accelerated shift, is going to be permanent to a large degree, and it probably will be the biggest legacy of, or at least the economic legacy of the pandemic. And we'll talk much more about it. But I'm kind of, it's interesting that every option here got a significant amount of votes. So I guess there are several important trends that are going to impact the next 5 years or so, and we're going to cover them in this webcast.
Frank, do you have any thoughts about these results? Great. Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's one of the areas that people are really interested in, and we've heard a lot of feedback from some of our members out there about really how critical remote work has been to their operations lately. If we can go back to the presentation. So we'll be talking about remote work and all of the other trends throughout this, I almost said podcast, but webcast. So right now I'll go ahead and kick this off to Gad so that he can give us a brief economic outlook.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Yeah, so before we get to the long run, let's bridge it through the short and medium terms. So in the very short term, in April, May, we had the deepest recession since the Great Depression. Since then, the recovery has been actually stronger than expected through the summer and probably through September as well. The economy continued to expand, a lot of that because of the continued reopening. But the recovery is slowing down. A lot of what is expected to be reopened already reopened, and we're now moving into the fall and winter, and there seems to be an uptick in the spread of the virus and also fading of the stimulus. So there are some headwinds that will slow down the recovery, and I think really the next time we'll have a boost in economic growth will be when there are clear timeline for the vaccine and treatment, where people are less afraid of going out and about. When that happens, we will see very strong recovery in those services that are very much related to social distancing, like travel and hotels and out of the home entertainment, full service restaurants and things like that. So we'll see a very strong recovery when that happens, but the question is when that will happen. I hope that some of it will happen in 2021, but it's still the timing of widespread vaccination is still, there's a lot of uncertainty about that. In the meantime, when people are spending less on some of the categories that I mentioned before, another very interesting trend is that people are buying goods way more than expected and way more than they did before the pandemic. So usually in a recession, spending on goods, especially discretionary goods, leisure-related goods, is dropping dramatically. But in this expansion, in this recession, it's growing dramatically because there is a lot of money to be spent that is not spent on those services that I mentioned before. In terms of the labor market, we have a high unemployment rate that is likely to remain quite high, but that overstates the current slack in the labor market. Typically when unemployment rates are high, companies find it easy to recruit. At this time, it's not the case, and that's because a lot of the people who are listed as unemployed are actually not actively or seriously looking for a job for various reasons. and that's why there isn't that much competition on job openings, and which typically happens in a period of recession, and that's why companies are still having difficulties recruiting. Especially difficulty in recruiting is in the technology, where we are in kind of a technology boom right now. The shift to remote work, to remote shopping, payments, telebanking, telehealth, remote learning, all of that is opening a lot of markets or expanding markets for tech companies. Especially the US tech companies are very well positioned. They are the leaders in those areas, especially software and business related technology. So US companies are very well positioned for that, as evident by their performance in the stock market, which is very impressive. It's not one story for every industry here. There's a lot of variation across industries, but also across locations. So there are certain vacation destinations that are harder hit, of course. Also, there are a lot of certain demographic groups, like less educated people, minorities, more women than men, that are concentrated in those hard-hit industries, and that's why those groups have seen larger job losses and higher unemployment rate, and that's likely to remain the case during the pandemic. Regarding 2021, as I mentioned earlier, that's less likely to, well, it all depends on the vaccine. If it's widely distributed in 2021, we're already going to see, I think, strong recovery. If it's more postponed to 2022, we will see it then. So I think it all depends on when the vaccine is coming out. There's a question here, what's the evidence that unemployed people are less likely to be seriously searching? Well, one thing is to look at the share of the unemployed that are permanent versus temporary. The share of people who are permanently unemployed is very low compared to the overall unemployment rate. A lot of workers are expecting to go back to their old jobs, and in many cases that will not happen, but those workers are not seriously looking for a job, I would imagine. Also, there are workers who are don't want to get infected, especially workers in the front lines, especially older workers that are more at risk, so they are probably not as desperate to get back to work, and people with children and the childcare crisis, also many of them don't have solutions and would prefer to stay home and take care of their children. And also at least it was mostly through July, we had very generous unemployment benefits that in fact at that point 2/3 of the unemployed made more money being unemployed than working, and that could have impacted the incentives of some of them to seriously look for a job. So for all of those reasons, we are seeing, and there are also measures of difficulty recruiting and difficulty finding a job that are not that unusual, certainly a very big disconnect from the very high unemployment rate. So, Elizabeth, that's the outlook for the economy in the next year. And you know, what we are going to focus on in this webcast is what happens after that. You know, hopefully by 2022 or 2023, the pandemic will be behind us. And the question, or the main question of this webcast is, what can we expect beyond the pandemic, say 2025? How will the US economy and labor market look at that?
Right, I think it's really important to start out with this short-term and medium-term outlook, and then if we move on to some of the longer-term trends and what we think are really going to drive future implications, especially in the labor market. Gad, can you take us through some of these as well?
Yeah. So we think there are several trends that are impacted by COVID that will have a significant impact on the US economy and labor market 5 years from now. So probably the number one, as evident from our survey, is what seems to be a permanent increase in remote work. I mean, some people will go back to the office, but the point is that even after the pandemic, the share of people who primarily work from home or partly work from home is going to be much, much larger than before the pandemic. And that is going to have an impact on recruiting, which we'll talk about later. There's also the accelerated shift to online shopping and home deliveries and other related things, related industries that are going to partly shift to online. Probably the biggest impact there is on retail. We see that even though there is a complete recovery in the amount of retail sales, the number of workers in retail sales is still very depressed, suggesting that a lot of the purchasing is done in online shopping, and that is going to have a big permanent impact. The retail apocalypse is finally here. Not that we were waiting for it, but it's here nonetheless. Also higher education, health, banking, a lot of those things that Elizabeth will talk more about later. Another important trend is automation. So companies always automate, but in periods where they're more desperate to cut costs, there is more energy to reorganize companies and replace workers with technology, and that is probably already happening to a larger degree and will continue to happen. Some groups of occupation are at a higher risk. I will especially mention office and administrative support workers. That's the group of occupations that had the most automation in the past decade, not manufacturing, and that's where probably we'll see a lot of automation and replacement of workers with technology in the next decade. That will partly reduce the demand for workers, less skilled workers or workers without a bachelor degree. But another very important trend that is going to happen is that the supply of workers without a bachelor degree is shrinking. If you look at the projections, and we'll show some charts later, the number of workers without a bachelor degree is rapidly shrinking. So in some sense, the decline in supply will kind of be at the same time as the decline in demand, which I think is for some in some reason is a good trend, because that means that the unemployment rate for less educated workers is not going to be very high for a long time. I think we will go back to normal unemployment rate for that group faster than many think. Also, especially in the hardest hit industries, we're going to see a lot of bankruptcies, a lot of mergers and acquisitions, a lot of private equity activity. So by the time we come out of this crisis, the industry structure is going to be much different than when we came in. And perhaps, although it's not entirely clear, a lot of smaller businesses will disappear more than larger ones, and we may end up in certain industries with higher concentration, where the big players are even stronger than they were before. Another very important trend is the state and local government budget crisis. It's already happening. A lot of revenues, especially sales-related revenues and other business activity-related, but also income income taxes is going down, and state and local governments are already cutting their spending. So industries that are um, largely funded by state and local governments, like education and health and some infrastructure, are likely to be impacted for quite a while because of that. And the final trend, it's worth mentioning, the decline of city centers, um, because a lot because of the shift to remote work. Now, many fewer people are actually coming to city centers for work, and that means that they're spending less on lunches, dinners, happy hours, dentists, banks, anything that they used to do in city centers during the workday, they are now doing elsewhere. Also, tourism is not coming to city centers, business travel, um, and a lot of other things. So city centers are likely to suffer more. We are already seeing that they are suffering more than other parts of the countries, but some of it will remain permanent because especially the shift to remote work is not going away. So fewer people will come to city centers to work even
Right.
in the longer run.
Oh, these are
So
just some great comments, right, about these different trends. We have some really good questions that are coming in as well, good commentary about people who are seeing in their businesses having difficulty recruiting workers, wage workers, or workers without a bachelor's degree. So, keep those comments coming in. There was a question about what we mean by the retail apocalypse. So just to quickly clarify that, we're seeing essentially a shuttering of a lot of brick and mortar retail stores, which has been accelerated by the shift to online during the pandemic. So that is essentially here and now. With those stores closing. And sorry, Gad, did you want to add anything else? I interrupted you.
no. I finished saying what I wanted to say, and I'm looking at the comments and and enjoying reading them.
That leads us to some other comments about the shift to remote work, which we had said that this might be the legacy of the COVID-19 pandemic, at least with the labor market. Gad, do you want to take us through this as well?
Sure. So so we did a survey among our members. We did one in April, right when the pandemic was at its peak, and one in September. And we asked questions about remote work, and there is a report coming out soon on that, and a webcast next week, right, Frank? Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, that's correct.
So I won't give you all the charts and stuff, but I'll just give you some of the top line stories from there. So, we look in terms of the perception of what will be the size of um, remote work in the future. There was a very large increase between what occurred in companies before COVID, and then already in April there was a higher expectation of that post-pandemic, but there was another very large increase between the April survey and the September survey. So many more companies feel that remote work is going to be the new normal for many of their workers. So we kind of take from it is that with 6 months or 5 months between the two surveys, that the overall perception is that remote work works and it doesn't hurt productivity. And that's probably, again, there are a lot of other surveys. Also, we see from online job ads that there has been a very large increase in the share of ads that indicates remote work. So this is very likely to be a permanent trend. And it's not doesn't work for every type of job. Like probably the majority of jobs you cannot do primarily from home. of course, all the blue collar and manual services, and even kind of the professional related jobs. It's hard to imagine that in the future elementary school teachers will work primarily from home, and also a lot of physicians and other health related occupations. But kind of the office related jobs, this is going to be a solution for many companies. More than any other group of occupations, it's the computer tech related occupations that where we see the very high share and a very large increase in recent months. And another group that is worth mentioning is the office and administrative support workers. Many of them are workers that are hourly workers or non-exempt workers, and companies were quite reluctant to let them work from home before the pandemic because it's hard to monitor how many hours they work and other reasons. Well, COVID forced everyone to move to home, and a lot of those barriers seems to be gone with the wind, and now there is much more willingness to let those workers work from home as well. There's some a big debate about remote work and productivity, which Elizabeth is going to talk more about later. But again, as a big picture, it seems to be a good experience the last 6 months. Most companies are more open to that, much more open than they were before. I think another very important implication of that is the willingness to hire people anywhere in the US. So in our survey, we asked about that as well, and there's been a very, very large increase in the willingness to hire 100% virtual workers anywhere in the US. So if in the past even remote workers were kind of constrained to the metro area to be in a daily or some high frequency arrival to the office, now it seems that is being loosened a lot, and there's more willingness to hire a large number of workers without the anticipation that they will regularly come to the office. And even there's a large increase but on a much smaller cases, there is an increase in the willingness to hire workers outside the country. So we may see a wave of offshoring of office-related job. It's been happening for decades now, but we may see another wave of that. And finally, the decline of city centers, which I actually talked about quite a lot, and we'll talk more later. So
right.
Move
and you talked about this a little bit already as well. That some of we've seen an increase in the share of job ads that are indicating work from home. Especially in certain occupations, like you mentioned some of these already. Sort of in the interest of time, I think we should move on to some of the longer-term trends that Frank was going to help us walk through. These is also increased share in full-time teleworkers here. Oh, Frank, did you want to walk through this?
Yeah, I can keep it quickly. I think to discuss further on the topic of office and admin support occupations, which Kat was mentioning, that there we see a strong increase now in teleworking. We were always wondering why this was not happening already before the pandemic. So in this chart, what we're looking at is the share of full-time remote workers, with the blue bars representing the early 2000s and then the dark gray bars representing 2018. So at the top of the list you find computer occupations, a strong increase, business and finance operations occupations also pretty strong increase, but in the middle of this list you see office and admin support. There was very little increase, only going to 3.3% in 2018, but as Gert is now saying, maybe this pandemic crisis has now crushed a lot of these barriers. So we will likely see an increase, especially in this group of occupations.
Right. Now, this is really interesting. It gives us more of a in-depth look at the occupations that are being more impacted by that remote work. And that takes us to our second poll question. We've really been focusing on remote work so far, and that question about productivity and the implications on worker productivity has been really highlighted. So for our second question, we want to know, for workers in your organization that have shifted to remote work due to the pandemic, how has their productivity changed? Increased substantially, increased moderately, no change, decreased moderately, or decreased substantially. Or if this isn't applicable to you, maybe there hasn't been a huge shift to remote work and most workers have continued to be on location or in the office, you can just not vote if it's not applicable to you. So let's go ahead and close that poll question. And it looks like there's been either no change or increased moderately are sort of the two top responses here, and about 11% saying it's increased substantially, and very few respondents saying that it's decreased at all. So we're seeing that there's an increase in productivity overall, which I think is in line with what we've been seeing in some of our own surveys and research. If we can close the poll question and go back to the slides.
Elizabeth, can I just comment on that? I think, if we did a survey among companies before the pandemic and we asked them similar questions, I think there would have been a big concern that productivity would decline if we shift to remote work. So the fact that, if anything, it seems like people think that it increased is perhaps the reason for why we're seeing a much more willingness than before to go to
Right. And then, I wanted to just really dig into this a little bit more as well. And like we've been seeing it in our own research and what our respondents just said, that remote work is productive. People are finding that the work is getting done. But really there's some long-term impacts or risk factors in terms of creativity and innovation. And on the right-hand side of this slide, there's an image here on productivity by the numbers. There are so many studies out there right now that are looking at this particular issue of remote worker productivity. It's overwhelming, frankly, how much is out there. And so trying to weed through it and make sense of it, for the most part, there's a consensus around the increased productivity. And there's one study that has been often cited saying that work from home employees increased productivity by 13% and made, working from home made them 50% less likely to quit as well. And this is from an economist, Nicholas Bloom out of Stanford. So this is a very reputable source, and it's highly cited. But even Bloom concedes that working from home in regular times is not the same thing as working from home during a pandemic, because there are so many other issues right now, right? Children at home, having to supervise them or helping them with online education, having the space and privacy that you need to work. Also choice. This isn't a choice for many people. They've been forced into working from home, whether they like it or not. So that may impact productivity as well. And then there are additional stressors that can impact motivation, well-being, and mental health, right? Like just being concerned about getting sick, the health or the well-being of your family members, losing your job, paying your rent or your mortgage, all of that adds up. There are also some studies that have shown that there are potential productivity differences between men and women from working from home during the pandemic, because women have borne a larger share of the child care and household responsibilities. So that has been taking them time away from work. And overall, business leaders are really concerned about that reduced time in the office leads to lower creativity and innovation, and ultimately lower long-term growth. So, if you're not collaborating in an office setting, what are the potential new products and services that are not being created and that will not show up in 2021 because of that? So those are some of the productivity research results there.
Yeah, Elizabeth, in the comments, there's a lot of discussion about the increase in stress and mental health and related factors. I just want to say about that there are now three things happening in the same time. One, we have a pandemic. Second, we have a recession. And third, we have an increase in remote work. So it's very hard to disentangle what's actually causing the increase in the stress and the mental health issues. It could be, I mean, the pandemic by itself could be a reason, a strong reason. A recession definitely increases stress, and remote work may as well. But you know, I think to kind of evaluate whether it's the remote work, we'll have to wait to a period after the pandemic where there is no pandemic and no recession to see if indeed remote work then is also by itself causing this increase in stress and mental health issues.
Definitely. And I also want to touch on some of these issues related to the most disrupted industries, that is in the long term after COVID-19. So let me take everyone through this section quickly. So in our research, we focused on a number of sectors that we think are going to be most impacted after COVID-19. So this is after there's widespread vaccination and people are comfortable, again, re-engaging in the economy and going out and shopping and doing some of those normal activities again. So starting with retail, you know, we expect there to be a lasting disruption really driven by this rise in e-commerce and increasing industry concentration. So we know that overall consumer spending has declined over this time period, really driven by online or by brick and mortar stores being closed and not being able to go out and go shopping. But that has been somewhat, you know, there's been the increase in online shopping has taken some of that away, right? Has enabled people to continue to spend. So on the right-hand side, you see the increase in electronic shopping as a percent of total retail sales. So at the height of the pandemic, it was about 19%. This was in April and May, and that was up from 13% before the pandemic, and it's now starting to settle down closer to 16% after some of those stores have started to reopen over the summer. But we do expect that lasting shift to online shopping to stay with us and to really drive the long-term outlook in retail. Also rising industry concentration, right? We're expecting those online retailers to get bigger. There's going to be more store closures and bankruptcies, a lot of opportunities for mergers and acquisitions. We're going to continue to see those big stores really driving out some of the smaller companies out of the market. We've talked a lot about city centers. We're going to see stores relocating away from those areas and into the suburbs as there's no longer commuters or people in city centers to go shopping. And then finally, some of those jobs in retail are really going to be susceptible to automation. There's going to be a rise in no-touch shopping technologies and robotics-powered fulfillment centers that are going to impact occupations such as cashiers, salespersons, shipping and receiving clerks. And these are jobs that were already susceptible to automation, but the pandemic has made them even more so as companies look to protect their workers and their customers from getting infected, and automation is one way to do that, is eliminating that person-to-person contact. Moving on to the next industry, so restaurants. On the right-hand side of the screen, you see a graph of the percent change in consumer spending from February, which is pre-pandemic, to August. Overall, at the top, you see that total consumer spending has declined 4% during this time, but that composition is different between goods and services. So spending on goods has actually increased 6%, while services has declined 8% because those are mostly in-person types of services. And when it comes to restaurant spending, at the bottom of the graph, you see a huge decline in spending in full-service restaurants and in bars and cafes. However, there's been almost no change in the spending to limited service restaurants, which have really been salvaged by that shift to online, right? To food pickup and delivery has really saved those types of establishments. So ultimately, we do expect consumer demand in this area to return to pre-COVID levels after the pandemic, but there's going to be a reallocation between those full service and limited service establishments as people start to become used to picking up their food and shift their preferences over time. So we expect some of that to stick. Rising industry concentration is an issue with this industry and with all industries, really. It's one of the themes that runs through this, that the big fish are getting bigger at the expense of some of the smaller minnows in the ponds. Relocation away from city centers as well, and some jobs are becoming more susceptible to automation as you can order online on your phone. Also new types of business models like ghost kitchens that don't even need hosts or hostesses or waiters and waitresses because they don't serve anybody. It's for online delivery only. So there's going to be more automation in the space as well. Moving on to higher education. So there's actually been some concern, right, amongst universities. Students are many of them are deciding to take a gap year because of the uncertainty about the quality of online higher education versus in-person, or students are switching from more expensive schools to least expensive ones or closer to home or even community colleges because of that uncertainty. And you can see on the right-hand side that the reopening models for colleges and universities for the fall of 2020. So in terms of shifting to that online component, if you look at those pieces of the pie that are fully online, primarily online, and hybrid, that's 2/3 that have some kind of online or a significant online component. And if you add those that are primarily in person that have some online component, that's about 88% that are shifting to some segment of their education online. So we do expect that to stick as well into the future. And it's going to mean overall that there's going to be an increase in, or actually return in consumer demand to pre-COVID levels after the pandemic. Hopefully this greater access to online education will lower that price point and make it more accessible to more people. Rising industry concentration here as well. Larger colleges with larger funding to shift to online are going to prosper at the expense of smaller colleges. And then the state government revenue shortfalls is going to have a huge impact, especially on those state public school systems that may have to eliminate degree programs or reduce their quality or reduce financial aid. This has huge implications for the labor market, right? Because this is our future workforce, and to the extent that the quality of the education changes because of going to online or reductions in certain degree programs, it's going to have huge implications for certain industries. Moving on to the next one, healthcare spending. We know that many people have delayed basic health care during the pandemic for fear of getting infected in some of these locations. So you can see here on the right-hand side how spending in hospitals on outpatient services, physicians, dentists, nursing homes, all of that has decreased substantially during the pandemic. But overall, we have an aging population. So there's going to be that demand for health care in the future that's likely to return to pre-COVID levels. And in addition to that, there's going to be an increase in the combination of in-person and virtual services, as there has been a shift to online in this space as well. Larger health systems are going to obviously do better during this time, especially if they've already invested in telehealth, whereas many small rural hospitals will likely go bankrupt because of a lack of funding and lost revenue due to people delaying care. The healthcare industry is also very susceptible to automation in terms of the jobs. These frontline workers are highly susceptible to the virus Hospitals are cutting costs where they can, so they're increasing their use of AI, robotics, and at-home diagnostic equipment that is automating certain functions that are done by nurses and medical assistants and other types of medical support staff. In the next industry, transit and ground transportation, this is one area where we don't expect the industry to recover to pre-pandemic levels. Here on the right-hand side chart, you see how spending on inner-city buses, mass transit, taxi cabs, and ride-sharing, so Uber and Lyft have really had a hard time during this time as well. Railway transportation, all of that spending from consumers has fallen off. Instead, people are buying their own bikes and new cars and used cars in order to get around. And those consumer preferences are likely going to stick in the longer term. We're going to see more uses of personal vehicles and micromobility options. Local government revenue shortfalls is also going to impact the ability of local governments to provide public transportation services, so we may see cuts in those types of transport services. And in terms of automation, because there's reduced funding, there's likely going to be delayed investment in autonomous vehicles, in bus systems and other public transportation. So the automation of these types of jobs is likely to be delayed also for a while until that funding comes back. So let me move on to the next slide here. Air travel and lodging, another area where we really expect a lot of cost cutting, right? Virtual meetings and cost cutting will permanently reduce demand for business. In air travel and lodging, here spending, you can see in the graph, has reduced for airlines, hotels, and foreign travel. For business demand, we expect to remain depressed because of remote work and reduced business travel. Rising industry concentration is an issue here as well. A lot of the airlines are cutting back on their service. Hotels are looking for ways to merge with, especially smaller hotels, looking for ways to merge with the larger chains, especially if those chains are more concentrated on the business customer. They're going to want to look to those smaller hotels, boutique hotels that are focused on domestic leisure travel to help them in the future. Automation is big here as well. There's been a lot of layoffs by the airlines, by hotel chains, and there's going to make certain occupations like customer service agents, hotel front desk workers, and clerks and housekeepers make their jobs at risk for automation because of the increased susceptibility to the risk of infection as well. And then lastly, I think there's one more, leisure and entertainment, where we have seen a huge decline in spending for movie theaters, spectator sports, live entertainment, amusement parks. But in this case, pent-up demand will ultimately drive spending back to pre-pandemic levels, right? People want those in-person experiences, those collective experiences with others with this type of service. We do expect a shift to online here as well with increased video streaming, and also traditional offline experiences may be more infused with some digital elements. There's a lot of opportunity for mergers and acquisitions among cruise lines, movie theaters, and other companies in this space. And automation, again, is likely to increase for certain occupations that have routine tasks and that are highly susceptible to infection. So ushers, lobby attendants, and ticket takers. So that's sort of a quick rundown of some of the labor market impacts of the most disrupted industries during this time. And let's shift to the most disrupted occupations. We have just a few minutes, so Gad and Frank, maybe you can tell me where you want to go from here.
Yeah, let me just briefly do that. And we are getting, there are many comments and questions that unfortunately we won't be able to address, but you can read each other's, which I think is probably even more important than listening to what we have to say, in some cases at least. So and it's also very helpful for us to know what you're most interested in, because there'll definitely be more webcasts on this topic and reports and stuff. But in terms of the most disrupted occupations by 2025, I think, going very briefly, technology, for the reasons that we mentioned, a huge growth in demand for technology workers. The office and administrative support, we mentioned automation will remove many of them, and also they will be going much more than before to remote working. Sales, there will be the shift to online shopping, so a lot of the retail sales jobs are already going away. But there was a good comment from Jack Kleinman's that many of those retail companies are hiring drivers and warehouse workers to deal with the home delivery, so that to some degree offsets the drop in sales workers. And there could be a lot of white collar jobs that will be offshored as a result of that. So those are some of the trends. I think in general the trends suggest that there will be less demand relatively for people without a BA in the future, but at the same time there is also going to be a shrinkage in the supply of those workers.
Yeah,
Frank, you
I
want
think
to
this
say a
is
few
one of
words
the
on
most
that?
most important underlying trends, a trend that we have been talking about a lot actually before this pandemic crisis when we talked about labor shortages. At the moment, of course, demographic trends are less important, but by 2025, probably it will be very relevant again. So we know that we have an aging population with the working age population that is going to grow very slowly. But when we divide that population, those with a bachelor degree and those without a bachelor degree, we see very different pictures, and that is what we want to show with this chart. So I first want to focus on the dark gray bars, which is the working age population growth for the entire population, or for all groups combined. And you can see that between the 5-year period 2022 to 2027, that's our projection, it's all the way on the right side, you can see that the working age population is only growing by 0.8% between that 5-year period. But if you then look at the blue bars, so then we look only at the working age population with a BA or higher, you can see that there's just steady growth and very rapid growth. So what's happening here is that a lot of young people are entering the labor market. They often now have a BA, and at the other end, we see a lot of retiring baby boomers that leave the labor force, and they generally, or a larger share of them, did not have a BA. So we see uninterrupted strong growth for the BA population, but when we look at the red bars, we see a quick deceleration. There was already negative growth between 2012 and 2017, and our projection is showing that this is going to go even stronger. So in 2025, the supply of workers that take generally occupations for which you do not need a bachelor degree, especially those employers may run into hiring difficulties again. Of course, let me emphasize here what has changed now compared to before this pandemic crisis is that we have a lot of companies restructuring, and as Elizabeth was talking about, there are going to be a lot of changes by industry.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. Elizabeth, I think we are almost running out of time, so the section about city centers, I think we would have a webcast devoted just to that in the next couple of months. I just want to show one last slide about automation, why we think that it's going to be heavily focused on office and administrative support workers. This is the share of office and administrative support workers in total employment. And we see that for almost 3 decades it's been going down very rapidly. In the last decade, their share in employment is dropping much faster than for manufacturing jobs, where that's where a lot of people have in mind when they think about automation. And there's still, we think, a lot of room for further automation in those occupations, because in some industries they are there has been very little automation of those jobs, so there's more potential there. But Elizabeth, let me turn it over to you to conclude. I think we unfortunately won't have time for the Cinti Center section. So
right, we'll definitely have another opportunity here. And looks like the slides, at least on my screen, went blank. Hopefully everybody else is looking at them. Okay, here we go. Yeah, I think this is all the time that we have for today, so I really want to thank Gad, Frank, and all of our audience members for joining us. If you like our program today, we have an upcoming webcast on the labor market update and the short-term outlook next month, but Frank is actually going to be leading another webcast next week, I believe, on the human capital responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. This is based on the survey that Gad had mentioned previously, so please check that out. Also, don't forget to, actually our podcast series also is online or at your favorite podcast app. Frank, Gad, and I do a monthly podcast on the monthly jobs report, really explaining it and so that you know what to pay attention to. And finally, don't forget to fill out the evaluation form at the end that will appear on your screen. It really is important for us to get that feedback. So again, everybody, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Elizabeth Crowfoot with the Conference Board, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.